Hi, everybody. I'm going to add Marissa here in a second, and then we will get started on our conversation. Thanks for being here. Just a second. Let's see. Hi, everybody. There she
Hi,
is.
we did it.
We did
Hello,
it
everybody.
without me awkwardly looking at the camera for 2 minutes.
Bless you
So
for doing
sorry.
it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we can
I feel like,
hear each other. This is great. Okay.
yeah, it's great. Hi,
Everybody who's
everybody. Thanks for being
joining, we'll
here.
see if we can do the multitasking thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll try
I
to do
can
a better
read.
job of watching the comments this time. Thanks everybody for your questions last time. When we did the last conversation, neither of us knew that it doesn't preserve the comments and the questions for us. Like we can save the video and post it, but it just gets rid of all of the
I
questions and
know,
comments.
so
So thank
sad.
you. Yeah, thank you for weighing in, and we will try to kind of keep up with things this time. But yeah, how are you?
Good. I'm good. It's, the day before Valentine's Day, Ash Wednesday, all of the things. So everyone's excited. Funnily enough, we're doing I don't know if you guys do stuff for Valentine's Day, but we do this bank, feast kind of and do a gift
Oh,
exchange among the family. And everyone's very excited. So I'm doing this and then I'm off to party. But how
you're
are you guys?
so organized. I'm impressed by that.
Well, so you can't see the chaos all around that's got us to this place.
Well, thanks for. I kind of sent you this article and was like, well, there's this article in the Atlantic that's kind of relitigating Dobson, and I feel like this would be another good one for us to talk about. That maybe probably not as many people saw because the Atlantic kind of lives behind a paywall.
Yeah.
But this article got quite a lot of attention because John Fea is a historian, and he's been kind of an interesting figure over the past, 5 or 6 years to watch because he's been very critical of Trump and very critical of conservative evangelicalism. Was sort of an early champion of people like Kristen Dumais who are writing critical works of scholarship on evangelicalism. And then, so this piece kind of came out of nowhere. It was sort of this about face trying to
Yeah.
reposition Dobson or kind of say okay, hold on, hold on, we've gone too far.
Right. Let's not
with our
get too carried away
yeah.
here. Yeah, that's the vibe it had for
Yeah.
me. And I don't know if you had a chance to say, I'll link, if we can link it somehow. Kristen Dumais responded with a rebuttal kind of explaining her work a little bit to say, and Beth Allison Barr did as well, because she was kind of named in passing in the article, in what came across to me as a dismissive way. So I would point people who did read the article to look at their responses where they kind of were saying, well, here's actually what we've said in our work, that maybe contradicts this point. But yeah, I definitely saw a lot of buzz about that. And the Elliot article, which we'll get to second, the one about Elisabeth Elliot. But I mean, on the whole, so how did it land with you? Aside from the kind of scholarly, I could almost feel the scholarly tension because I imagine these are all colleagues.
Yeah.
Right?
I think so. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, first of all, he kind of backpedals on some compliments that he gave to both Kristen Dumais and Beth Allison Barr for their work. And in this piece, yeah, he sort of backpedals and.
Oh, good. Someone's saying quick synopsis for those of us who didn't get past the paywall.
Yes.
Good. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
So John Fea wrote this article, and the gist of the article is recent scholarship is contributing to this negative narrative around evangelicalism. It's kind of piling on and really going after these evangelical figures who did a lot of things right. Like they provided some really useful tools to evangelicals of their time, and the work that Kristen Dumais is doing is sort of painting this narrative in an unnecessarily negative light. And here are some examples of how. And the most important example that he offers is that of his father and some things that he thinks his father learned from James Dobson about fatherhood and parenthood, and he's sort of saying don't contribute to this idea that all of evangelicalism is bad, or all of the advice and the writing and the work of these people was all bad, and the work of a lot of these scholars is just piling on at this point.
I think he called it like flat and negative,
Yes.
and he's opening, understandably so, with this anecdotal story of really how his father was very, in Fee's words, patriarchal and abusive.
Mhm.
And it was in listening to, Fee identifies it as it was because he listened to Dobson and Focus on the Family, and kind of was formed in an evangelical faith. This became a better situation in their family home life. And then he kind of closes the article pointing at statistics of like, look at good things evangelicals are doing. So that's kind of the storytelling framing here, which I had thoughts about, but that's a little bit of, does that kind of cover the summary of the article?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I mean, and there's more to it obviously than that, but those are like the big the big picture ideas.
Yeah. He's kind of saying it's important to understand a little bit of a defense for evangelicalism. Like, it's important to understand why people were drawn to it and are still drawn to it, kind of as a piece of his argument that he doesn't want to see lost.
Yeah, and someone just asked the question, does the article acknowledge that Focus on the Family is still there? It doesn't really talk a ton about Focus on the Family as an ongoing entity, more just about Dobson himself,
Yeah.
and Dobson's broadcast.
And it's kind of an odd thing because Fee himself acknowledges like it was the radio program when he was growing up that impacted his father, but then acknowledges that Fee himself as a parent rejected some of those things, did not do purity balls, did not do things. In fact, appreciated Dumais. I think it was one of his adult daughter's college. She was one of his adult daughter's college advisors, and they had some kind of relation. Anyway, so it was this interesting sort of his perspective, thinking as a child, saying this was good in my family, but he did not replicate it as a parent. So there was a little disconnect. So he didn't really quite go into the detail about what specifically, but it did come across as a defense of Dobson in many ways, I think. And when I first read it, it pinged for me the kind of, and I wrote a Twitter thread, I'll link to it later, but it really pinged to me those phrases you hear maybe when you're talking in an extended family or in a family culture about harmful dynamics or abuse, particularly abusive dynamics. And a lot of people will kind of say, but think about all the good they did, or people are complex, or it wasn't as bad as they had it, because he does kind of even say that about his father. Like, his father grew up in a really patriarchal home. And so there's a little bit of that, that I think, unfortunately, often has an effect of minimizing the harm. That multiple things can be true. Like, it can be, things could have been worse for a previous generation, doesn't necessarily mitigate that there could have been harmful things in a future generation, things like that. So that was the kind of emotional tenor I received it as, even though I think there are some valid points worth looking at. I mean, something I know we've talked about is, I do think Dobson's efforts were a piece of Christian men kind of being launched to attend to their families in ways they maybe otherwise wouldn't have. But I saw your reel this week kind of saying, well, do we assign the credit of that to Dobson, or what can you speak to that a little bit? Like, what else was going on culturally?
Yeah, so this kind of depends on like what era of, I mean, Dobson had a long career. So Dare to Discipline was 1970. That was his first big bestseller, but he was, by the 90s, he occupied this just incredibly influential position in American evangelicalism. And by the 80s and 90s, like, you had a lot of movements like Promise Keepers and some like male authors who were trying to encourage Christian men to be more in touch with their families, more in touch with their emotions. This was not like just coming from Dobson. Like, if I don't, and the author of that article doesn't go into whether his father, had any run-ins with Promise Keepers, but that was like a key element of Promise Keepers. So even in evangelicalism, his father could have been getting this kind of messaging about the value of being a present father, a loving father. He could have been getting those messages from other places.
Well, and I kind of wonder, having grown up, that's kind of my generation. Like, I remember growing up in the 80s and 90s. Even popular culture was pivoting that. You see that a little bit in the sitcoms of family life, portrayed family American life. I'm thinking of like Cosby Show or, Full House, or these ones, which I'm not trying to make a case that that was like representative of American life, but you see these trends of family life of sort of saying, what does that look like to have fathers present in this way?
Yeah. And so I think Dobson, I think it might be a little bit generous to put him in the driver's seat of any of that. Um, and I'm just not really convinced that if well, and I shouldn't say I don't know. I don't know John Fea personally. I don't know anything about his family life. But if a parent in the 80s or 90s, if a father was in sort of an authoritarian parent, had grown up with an abusive parent, or believed the value of corporal discipline, but was overly violent or overly angry, and read a book like Dare to Discipline, um, my thought as
Mhm.
now and is that that book kind of gives cover to that. It gives spiritual cover to the authoritarianism. It doesn't really reject the authoritarian tendencies.
Mhm.
Um, it doesn't say don't spank your kids. It doesn't say don't hit your kids. It says don't be angry when you hit your kids. Don't be abusive. Don't be
Yeah.
yelling. They're like it. So it kind of gives this interesting spirit. Not interesting. It gives spiritual
Yeah.
cover to this. And so
Yeah.
I yeah I don't know.
And I
I think
think,
there.
like I read Dare to Discipline yesterday when I was doing this because I was like, I want to get this fresh. I was looking at the Elliot stuff too. And I did find Fee's comment. He does say somewhere, let's see, he lists Dobson's credentials about clinical professor of pediatrics at University of Southern California School of Medicine and a staff doctor at the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. This is a quote. He had a pedigree that impressed uneducated working class evangelicals like my dad. And as I was reading Dobson's book yesterday, I was thinking about, especially coming right off of Tripp's Shepherding a Child's Heart, Dobson comes across as 1970s science-y. Like he's got statistics, he's got, I mean, I don't know how robust or how much they hold up, but he is quoting psychological research. Like about half the book really felt like maybe his dissertation from when he was a school counselor. Something. A lot of it is in the classroom
Yeah.
and is talking about dynamics in education. There's a whole chapter on drug use, so you really get the fear of the culture of that moment. And have you gotten to that part yet? There's like this fictionalized story he does, second person, of a teen's rapid decline into
Oh
drug use. That's like full of fear. Like almost every anecdote is full of fear. There's one about a teenage daughter who assaults her mother and leaves her in a pool of blood. I mean, it like you can feel the kind of the societal fear pulsing on the page. And but it's presented in it actually reminds me a lot more of, I don't know if you've read any of John Roseman's parenting, but this sort of kind of uh, it's interesting how their own parenting approaches come through in their writing style. Just this authoritative, this is how it is, here's a claim. But yeah, absolutely. He's not saying a gentler way. In fact, he's saying we need more authority. He
yeah
says, quite frankly, he calls the parenting of the 50s and 60s permissive,
yeah
which is why Roseman came to mind, because Roseman's one who writes similar to Dobson current day, but talks about how the culture of the 50s and 60s was authoritative parenting, and we should get back to that. So I always find that very interesting when all the parenting experts are like, back in the day it was this way or this or another way. But anyway, yeah, for sure, I do think this would give license to harm. And in fact, we hear the countless stories of families where it did, right? It's done so much harm, and many people who do not I think found this a painful article to read, honestly, because it feels like a rebuttal that makes a zero-sum game or something, that says, well, if people had bad experiences, then that somehow discounts that it wasn't a horrible experience in my family, or vice versa. And that's simply not true. Like, multiple things can be true, and probably the impact of this is as individual as each family's dynamics, and the value of someone like John Fea being able to tell their story, because I think they are free to and should feel free to, should not come, I think, with the silencing or flattening of the other stories,
mm-hmm.
especially when for so long these sort of resources have kind of reigned as authoritative. Like, there is a little bit of dethroning of them going on currently through the work of scholars and others and people telling their stories. But I don't know if we need to necessarily defend the kings in that sense.
And I think early when you sort of asked about Dobson's position in all of this, like I think it's really important to remember that, like, when Dobson writes Dare to Discipline in the 70s, that's a reaction, right? Like,
Yeah.
he's reacting to the politics and the social upheaval of the 60s and 70s. It's very much a reaction to the U.S. kind of just failure in Vietnam, and also the phenomenon of young people protesting the war and pushing back on some like very closely held values of previous generations, like patriotism and willingness to serve country, God and country, you know, those things being so closely. And so
it's interesting. He talks about like pacifism being a problem, like the protest in this book. Yeah, it's interesting.
It's a huge threat. It is a threat that he is like mapping spiritual rebellion onto it, when it's a social problem. But it's a social problem because, you know, in the view of many Americans, we were involved in a very violent and unjust war. Instead of grappling with that, he sort of looks and says, like, oh, the kids these days, you know. So the Dobson of the 70s is very much pushing against that particular moment. And I think if you like read Dobson in a vacuum now and you don't like keep that in mind, it's really easy to kind of forget how aware he was of the politics. And then as conservative Christianity becomes more political over the 70s and 80s, Dobson himself becomes more political. I mean, people who are aware of him and his political advocacy in the 90s know that his work was not all about you know, parenting young kids. It was also about the gay agenda. It was about satanic panic. It was about drugs. It was about crime, everything. And
and a lot of I thought what was interesting is to see a lot of the threads of the drugs, sexual morals, and crime show up. And to me, it made me wonder, honestly, a couple things, because reading this, there was actually very little specifically Christian verbiage even in this book. There's a very kind of almost a appendix chapter written to mothers where some Bible verses show up, but otherwise it was pretty minimal. I think he was writing to a secular culture when he wrote this from, and this is speculation, but his experience in his 20s in the classroom felt like informed most of it, because when he wrote this, he had a 5-year-old and an infant, but he's talking a lot about teenagers and adolescents and behavioral problems that felt much more in line with what maybe a school counselor encountering breakdowns of authority or problems teens were having, that perspective brings. So I found that really interesting to wonder, and our book isn't a Dobson biography or something, but I know there are some good ones out there that I'll probably read, because I'm curious to see when he pivoted to more spiritualized language and more Bible verse, and this is God's way, because it's kind of only tangentially even referenced here as I kind of think this is a Christian perspective and served us well, but not certainly nothing like we see with Tripp, who I don't think would have liked this book.
Right.
I think they would have been at odds.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. I think they absolutely would have. Tripp would have been like, you're missing the problem. You're missing the bigger problem. You're missing the spiritual sickness,
and you're bringing in too much psychology and science.
Yeah,
and the day
understanding of Dobson's early, like of the Dare to Discipline book, and the kind of lead up to that is that he developed that book and some of his early writing as like public talks on like the speaking circuit. I'm trying to remember the name of the book that I'm thinking of, but it gives a really helpful accounting of how he kind of would go and travel and give these talks, and found that talks on discipline were really well attended and really seemed to resonate with audiences. And so his development of his teaching on discipline in the 70s was very responsive to what he perceived as an interest in the topic from these crowds.
Which is interesting. Because yeah, early on he's talking a lot about self-esteem and other things that a lot of Christian parenting experts don't include and actually react against. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, and I, again, I need to do some more reading on his kind of biography and trajectory, but my sense is that, he kind of found that the topic of discipline really stuck. And over the next 10 years, he starts to distance himself from psychology as a field and starts to reject what that has to offer and really grab on to, the Bible as the authority and kind of away from his expertise exactly.
Yep.
Which I think is also an interesting move.
It is really interesting. Well, and one other thing I wanted to note, and maybe this takes us, unless there's more you want to talk about, the Fea article to the Elliot article that Liz, I should have looked up her name, Liz Charlotte. What is the author's last name if you have it in front of you? But as I was, these all hit in the same week. So we had Fea coming out kind of saying, critiques of Dobson are too flat, they don't judge maybe the intentions of all evangelicals, and what about the good? We had, when the Elliot article dropped, it caused a lot of stir, and it seemed like a lot of authoritative complementarian voices were saying, well, now, what is this? Cancel culture. We can't have this. We shouldn't be disgracing the memory of a deceased author, or, her husband who's in memory care, I think right now, or in assisted living. And then there was this random rabbit trail I ended up going down, because there's a small group of people trying to do a documentary in response to Shiny Happy People, like exposing it as lies. And, I don't think it will get any traction, but because I am who I am, I pulled on that thread and I wanted to know who was behind it. And it's a woman who was involved with IBLP back in the day, and she's in a sect of Mormonism right now. But she had written an ebook. Have we talked about this yet? She's a parenting coach. She's a self-platformed parenting coach. She wrote an ebook, and it was available on Kindle Unlimited. So I was like, I will see what she has to say. And it's a horrible ebook. And I'll give an abuse content warning, and I won't go into graphic detail. But her whole method is called the cover the mouth method, where you cover the mouth of children. But why it really echoed with me, because I thought, this is what this documentary group is attempting to do, to cover the mouth of survivors saying Gothard harmed us. We're going to rebuttal this. There's a little bit of that flavor in the other pushback groups that are saying, no, we don't want to tarnish someone's memory. So we don't want to hear about how these teachings harmed people. Or even Fea saying, we don't want to talk too much about that. We don't want to go too far in entertaining that Dobson might have harmed. And I think all of that is super unhelpful, because I don't think everyone doesn't need to see everything the same way. I think people may or may not agree with different points in the article, but the covering people's mouths, or the attempt to say, so we shouldn't talk about it, or we need to really have certain guardrails in ways to talk about it only that we'll accept. I think it compounds the harm the people who've been hurt by it are experiencing, and also just doesn't really get us anywhere productive. But anyway, that was my...
Yeah, well, and it just, it privileges the story of...
Yeah, and here's someone saying, discrediting the person bringing up objective facts. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Discredits the people.
Stories of where it looks like it worked, and then it treats stories where it led to abuse as user error. Like,
yes.
it sort of chooses which stories to privilege when you do that, and I think that's a problem, and I think that's the problem, that's the impulse. I understand the wanting to protect legacies of people who you respect, and I also understand the impulse wanting to protect your parents, right? Like, I think people who they know their parents really revered Dobson and they want to protect even their parents from accusation using material that encouraged abuse. So I understand that impulse. And that really is showing up all over the place in evangelicalism right now. There's a real concern that we are doing a bad job of publicly reckoning with the legacies of important individuals.
Mm.
And we see this with Jonathan Edwards. We see this with all manner of historical figures, as people kind of say, like, well, did you know they also? And then there's like the ensuing battle over like what part of their legacy matters, or will their legacy survive?
Well, and I think on a meta level, this kind of ties into what is such a core part of so many of these teachings, is that you revere authority without question because it's God ordained. So in a certain sense, it is the touch not God's anointed. It is the do not speak out against your parent. It's very deeply rooted in the teaching itself, that if people raised in this were imbibed with, it's very difficult to figure out ways to say, well, which is why for me personally, I feel like we do also though need to be reminded that there's a difference between talking about an elderly neighbor's marriage and someone who sold millions of copies of books about marriage, or talking about maybe our individual parents and individual family systems that I do think so many things were mitigated in different families that are impossible to tease out. But what we can look is the teachings that were sold to millions of families. And I do think that is something we need to not shy away from, which is maybe what gets spliced out. And it is why it gets very complex. I think, yeah, the defensiveness, the understandable protectiveness, the impulse to make our own experiences normative for everyone. Yeah. And I think, as we've mentioned before about other resources, there are reasons people reached for it, which is why I appreciated Fea acknowledging that there were reasons people were drawn to it. And I've spoken to people from that generation who said, yeah, absolutely. We came from homes where we were abused, or it was chaotic, or we had no path. And so here was a Christian saying, here's a path. And that was very appealing, and maybe was comparatively better than what the older generation had experienced, which I found very interesting. If you guys have seen on Instagram, I've been posting about this book a little bit, because this was written by Elisabeth Elliot's great grandfather. And I'm going to do some reels on it because I found a lot of interesting things in it. But one thing he says that really gives me pause, and I never see it in parenting resources, but he basically, maybe it's just a view of the late 1890s and of human progress, but his take basically was like, but the next generation will always be better than the previous. And he kind of just states that, and is like, or that's his kind of take. And I don't know if I would hold to that or anything, but I do think there is a generational shift as we seek to try and understand, well, something may have been better than what certain children received, and they grow up as an adults and offer something better than they had received. That doesn't necessarily mean it still can't be a negative impact on the next generation in various ways. So anyway.
Yeah, I need to read that. When you posted that, I was like, oh,
this one?
Yeah, because I think a lot of evangelicals think of this as sort of like moving in this line, like, oh, people used to be able to punish their kids. People were so much better disciplined. It's been like this long drift away from well-behaved children with respect for us. But if you look at Christian writing about parenthood of the Victorian era, like the late 19th century, it is very much like that. Like the way that others are discussed, the way children are discussed, the way the home is discussed. The concern is not discipline. The concern is like nurture and gentle love and quiet. Now, that said, like, for sure, corporal punishment was just sort of in the water.
Exactly.
Right?
And he talks about, he talks about in passing whipping children, but what you're not getting, which I found was interesting, is like a step-by-step manual of how to do it and pray and all of this. And in fact, you're getting a lot of cautions. And I posted some in a thread, and when I do the reel, I'll point it out. He has a whole bit where he talks about how anger has done so much harm in families. And it was so striking after reading so many Christian parenting books talking about the importance of being calm and cool and detached while you spank, like that's the godly way, to read a Christian parent saying, no, you should regulate yourself, and then you'll probably find out you don't, like, spanking's not the choice you want to make. It was just, it's a slight nuance, but it's quite different than what you see in a lot of the other ones, which is like, no, you must spank. You just have to detach and do it the right way, versus someone saying, probably your anger is taking you in a place of harm, so regulate, and then you probably won't need, this is not what you need to. So anyway, I thought it was really interesting. So this was fascinating. I want to revisit this one if we do a discussion on, always you see these periodically, people will pop up and say, well, gentle parenting, Christian gentle parenting isn't a thing, they'll say, or whatever. So I think it's interesting to find someone who has it reminds me a lot of Charlotte Mason stuff, like a lot of threads that are very respectful of children, very empathetic, very acknowledging their autonomy, their personhood, their will, all of that, in really notable ways. So, however, so what made me curious to dive into this is because, so summary of the article of Elisabeth Elliot. And I printed it off. I'm so sorry to the author of the article. I hate removing the author's name, but I printed it off like this, so I don't even have it.
Charlotte Grant.
Thank you so much. That is correct. I know it was Liz Charlotte, but okay. So Grant writes about summary of this article. If you didn't have a chance to read it, it's kind of tangentially related. She's talking about the biographies that have been written in recent years, talking about Elisabeth Elliot's legacy. And if you're familiar, Elliot's written, dozens of books. I don't know how many, maybe hundreds. So much material, radio program for many years, so much influence. A lot of her writing was on family life, and particularly marriage and courtship. But Grant is exploring how the broader evangelical culture talks very little about her third marriage. And both biographers identify what I think is pretty uncontestable. I haven't really seen anyone push back on this. A lot of red flags for a very controlling husband, questions over abuse, questions over her well-being. And in fact, friends and family, even near the end of her life, tried to kind of get Elisabeth away, separate her out from her husband, try and get her to safety in different ways. But she wanted to go back to her headship, God's head for her. And so for me, and Grant kind of explores her own personal thoughts on this, and what does this mean for a culture that has elevated the teachings of a person, if that person, about marriage, about submission, about the authority in marriage, if that person is struggling and entrapped in an abusive situation, essentially. And it's a thoughtful article and well written, and caused a lot of stir because Elisabeth Elliot is beloved, and many people revere her, almost, I think, like a Protestant saint in many ways. And she has such a rich legacy. And when I read the article, it pinged for me both of these books, both this one, which this is written by Elisabeth's great grandfather, and on her paternal side, and this one, which she has written with kind of reflections from her mother on their family life. And I'd read them years ago, but they had both kind of left me with a impression that there was a lot about duty and self-sacrifice and self-denial. So I was kind of wondering, how does that play in? Like, is there a trajectory that says, oh, by the time this third marriage comes around, something has happened that is unique, such that a partner might be kind of entrapped in an idea of submission? Or I was wondering, well, this seemed to be a big piece of family life teaching from the beginning. So kind of wanted to reread that. And it was interesting to see in this book, Elliot talks a lot about duty and obedience and self-denial and submission. Trumbull has it a little bit, but they're quite different flavors, which also is interesting. But anyway, I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts as you read through this, or how you see it aligning with kind of especially the way we pedestal people and their legacies.
Yeah. So I did not read a ton of Elisabeth Elliot growing up. I think, like most evangelical teenagers, I read Passion and Purity. I don't really remember anything of it. But what I did find myself thinking of was, so Kate Bowler's book, The Preacher's Wife. the whole book is sort of about how in evangelicalism, women who have felt called or gifted to leadership have always had to carve out these alternative spaces to do so. They've been excluded from eldership, from the pastorate, from all of these traditional leadership roles. And so in the book, she kind of describes all the different ways that women build power and wield influence in the church. And Elisabeth Elliot is one like obvious example. But what I remembered from Kate Bowler's research was that Elisabeth Elliot's trajectory a little bit also shows the way that like the incentives of the market of evangelical publishing will kind of uh, incentivize certain shifts and changes. And so I actually marked the place because I wanted to read it because it describes it. Kate Bowler writing it, not me, because she describes it so well. But so for those of you who aren't familiar, Elisabeth Elliot's first husband was killed as a missionary. And it was only a couple years into their marriage. They had a really young child. But she, in the wake of that murder, became a celebrity. Like there were tons of requests for interviews. I mean, everybody wanted to talk to her. She stayed in Ecuador. I think it's Ecuador where they were.
She stayed as a missionary there and kind of became the spokesman for all the widows, because there was a group of missionaries who were killed and all the widows were left, and she kind of became their appointed spokesperson. And
yes, and so she decides to stay. And as the story kind of spreads, this modern day martyrdom story really captures the imagination of evangelicals in the US, and she becomes a celebrity. And so this is now, I'm reading from this passage here. The stories of Elisabeth Elliot's loss and hard insights as a missionary to that tribe and others catapulted her to evangelical stardom, a Protestant Mother Teresa of sorts who brought recognition to post-World War II conservative Christian culture and its missionaries' dreams of evangelizing the world. But by the 1970s, American conservatives were not as engrossed in the stories of mission martyrdom that sent single women out into the jungle to preach. The Christian home was under siege, and the star of the decade would be evangelical and Pentecostal women who declared that they were called on to defend it. And so she launched into stardom and writes books and becomes this figure. But by the 1970s, because of the political atmosphere, evangelical concerns did no longer aligned with her persona. So the domestic writing, the family life writing that she does later in her career is, she had every incentive to shift her focus with the time.
Yeah. Well, and it aligned with her own. It was interesting to me when I was reading this. She talks a lot about this was published in the 90s, so I don't know when she wrote it, but originally published in the 90s. But she talks, there's this one part where she talks about seeing the bumper sticker question authority, and how she's very offended by that. You can tell by her writing that the societal changes that would question authority, that would challenge authority, and of course that made me think of Dobson and the shifting trends away from that. And she notes it a lot, and her complementarian hierarchy comes through very clear in this. She has a couple chapters even on it, the father as the head of the home, in very specific ways, in very ways that, to me, because I didn't read her stuff as a young person, so I didn't read Passion and Purity. I think I for whatever reason a little bit out of youth group by the time that maybe swept through the same way. But anyway, when I read it was interesting to think she is bringing a lot of that in, and she writes in a couple places like she doesn't think her mother would have ever questioned that because it's the way it was. But you don't ever see her mother saying that, right? It's Elliot kind of saying this is, and very well could be. I'm not questioning her ability to interpret her family situation. It just is interesting to think of how kind of like with spanking, there's a sense of if this was the way it was, like children were switched very young all the way through, even in the Victorian era, would though those same individuals think of spanking the way a Dobson does or a Ted Tripp does. Is it fair of Tripp to look back in there any more than it is probably for me to look back and say, well, they would see things the way I do it? So I'm not quite sure, but you see the threads in there of her decisions, her positions that she'd made, really shaping her view of the past, kind of how she's thinking about the past with contemporary terms. And I thought it was interesting because Grant in her article talks about Elisabeth. The biographers of these two biographies describe Elisabeth as being responsive even in her writing. Like, she's peppered with questions. She kind of is kindly responding. She's a lot of times trying to redirect people and saying, this is just my thoughts. You should read the Bible. Like, don't listen to me. But a lot of the questions are geared in this way, and she's continuing to produce this content to address them, and in very clear terms. I thought it was so interesting. I came across an old blog post of hers, or website post, I should say, rather, where she does quote a few passages from her great-grandfather's book, but all of them are about duty and obedience. And that's actually a very small thread of what he talks about when you read it in one sitting. And again, I'm not contesting her memories of her family, but it's interesting that that's the point she wants to spotlight later in the 90s. She wants to talk about duty and obedience and self-denial and self-sacrifice when that's not happening here. Mm-hmm. Or thinking about Grant's article as well, when she writes about her father, who was very devout and sounds almost scrupulously so, but he was very embarrassed by fundamentalism and kind of these legalism in that sense. But you have maybe more of that creeping into the evangelicalism in the 90s in a different way. It was very interesting to kind of see the clash of different things. And of course, it made me want to read the biographies a lot as well.
Yeah, me too. And it just, I think like recognizing, as someone who hasn't read a ton of her own writing, I feel like I have less of a sense of how she tried to position herself as a public figure than I do Dobson. I've read, listened to more of Dobson to the point that I'm comfortable saying he wanted to be a public figure and wanted to claim a high degree of spiritual authority behind his advice, right? Like, I mean, he's on record saying, like, these aren't my ideas, they're God's ideas. Like, this is a thing that I don't know to what degree Elisabeth Elliot, like you said, it sounds like sometimes she's sort of writing from a more reflective point of view.
Right. Well, and I don't know how much she wanted to be positioned. She is very clear, at least in this book, she is very clear that she believes there is a hierarchy in the home, that's God ordained, that it needs to be that way. And she even talks about Genesis. She gives a little kind of passing interpretation of the Genesis narrative as Adam failing in his kind of duty to keep his wife from deception. So, a very kind of complementarian understanding of those things. And I've heard, as the chatter of this online has come up, you see surfacing again the ways the empire building of evangelicalism in the 80s and 90s made some strange bedfellows. So you have Elisabeth either sharing a platform or speaking at an IBLP conference at one point. You have like anecdotal people remembering that there was some cross-referencing going on there. And so some of it, I think, maybe is similar to what we might see in the contemporary moment of people with very different theological beliefs rallying over certain talking points that they think will benefit society. So sort of saying, well, we might hold really different theological beliefs over here, but we all can unite on how important it is for there to be authority in the home or authority in the family or hierarchy in marriage, kind of, and the patriarchy, the male headship, and she uses those terms. So I don't think I'm putting words in her mouth, but I do think it's sort of like, for me, reading all of this in kind of one sitting, I thought, I'm not sure how anyone who, though, sincerely believes a theology that suffering comes from God's hand for our good, you are to deny yourself. There is a God-ordained order. Whatever was happening in her marriage, I don't think how anyone who is in a marriage that is harmful, who believes those things, can find the agency to exit, because the theology has sort of enabled someone to say, well, all suffering, no matter how hard, I can learn from, or is God teaching me, and I'm supposed to deny myself, and I'm supposed to do my duty even when it hurts. And I don't know, obviously, what happened in this specific, in their privacy of their marriage, but I do think the theologies themselves enable that and make that very difficult for someone to find agency, because someone's saying, I've seen it happen so many times. Absolutely. Because any disclaimers in these books of like, we know abuse is bad, or we know spanking is bad, those are all subjective disclaimers. And how bad is so bad that you need to defy God's authority? Who's supposed to determine that? The person who's been victimized is supposed to somehow say, well, that's too far. It's very disempowering.
Yeah.
I to tell people God wants them to continue to submit to things that hurt them, and it will somehow work out for their good, or that remove agency. That was another interesting thing I found. I think Grant writes about how Elisabeth kind of hesitated about marrying her third husband. He pursued her. She wasn't sure. And somewhere else, it might have been in here, but somewhere else I was reading this week, she talks about how she didn't want to marry him, but she opened her Bible, prayed about it, and kind of saw a verse about God giving, I think from 1 Corinthians, God giving different gifts to different men. And so that was confirmation for her. And I think that really fits in with a lot of the Bible believing zeal of the mid and late 1900s. And yet I think it's worth examining. That's a nouthetic framework as well. It plays out in there. So I don't know, a lot of things, individual stories are always so complex, and it's very difficult to put people, I mean, I'm not interested in putting people in boxes, even people who we've all pedestaled, but I do think examining their teaching, putting their teaching under the microscope is really important, and really important, the impact, because I mean, as Christians, we're to look at the fruit, of course, but also because we care about whether the theologies were touting harm. And I think in the interest of truth, there were some excellent threads about both these articles saying, but it's kind of what we've said before too, do the promises hold? Like if someone is up there saying, this is the way to a godly household, this is a way to raise children who are successful and good and you have a good relationship, or this is a way to have a happy, wonderful marriage, but the outcome of that aren't those things, then it should at the very least give us pause and reconsideration.
Yeah, and I think with Elisabeth Elliot, the interesting and potentially dangerous part of her legacy is that because she's taken on this sort of almost saintly role, in a tradition where like women pastor theologians are few. She's been able, her writings have taken on this role where they get, soundbited and sampled over and over again now, like little proverbs. And so like when I'm looking at Tradwife content, for example, I see quotes from her all the time, or I see her held up as an example. And there is a difference between just sort of like leveling an ad hominem at someone, like disqualifying them just on the basis of who they are. And I don't want to do that with Elisabeth Elliot in particular. But what's happened with her is that because she's become this unimpeachable figure, almost this totally inhuman figure, because of the martyrdom story, because of all of this, it protects her and her teaching from scrutiny in a lot of ways. And I think that sometimes the influence or the certain downstream effects of it become invisible or just assumed to be the fruit of this, of course, will be good. She becomes this, like I think, this neutral figure that really all that neutral if you look underneath.
Yeah.
So,
and it's something we just don't want. I think I want to say we don't want unchallengeable teachers. Like we just don't want, we shouldn't want that, because if you have unchallengeable, untouchable leaders, I don't think trustworthy teachers want that either. And I do appreciate that Elisabeth, if Grant is correct, attempted to do that. I appreciate so much that this book opens up with a preface where he's saying, these are just observations I've made over decades of life, and I do them with, I give them with fear and trembling. What a different posture. So even, there are things I don't love in here and take issue with, but as a whole, you're much more able to say, yes, this is another person with feet of clay who is subject to error. And I think about this a lot because as a young person, when I went to seminary, I did a whole course on Jonathan Edwards, and was, read all his teaching. It was very intense. I admired his intensity a lot because that was my wiring. And I read biographies, and it wasn't until much, much later that I learned he married a very young woman who procured slaves, that this is how they managed to run this household with 11 children while he wrote in his study his intense writing for hours and hours each day. And it doesn't make his work nothing, it doesn't mean he has nothing to say, but it does say something about who we choose to pedestal. And I think that's very interesting, and I think someone like Elisabeth Elliot, it is interesting that in the complementarian sphere, here's a woman who is a pastor, teacher, theologian, speaking authoritatively to men and women. But because what she is saying is something we admire, like Edwards, his intensity is something we admire, or his certain sermons are something we admire, his historical legacy we admire. We keep them on the pedestal. And no one belongs on pedestals. This is not the way of Jesus's followers. I keep thinking of 1 Corinthians 3 whenever I read these things, because Paul is very clear, like, stop it with the I follow this person, that it's no good, kind of. He's saying, and it can cause harm to the temple of God, which is the people of God, the church. So I don't know. I do think it's interesting that there's a knee-jerk protectiveness from communities. We don't like iconoclasts. We don't like when people touch our kings and queens, and that's difficult to reckon with. I feel that too. I mean, I have my own heroes who I think should be admired. It's difficult to reckon with their ordinariness, for sure. But I think the string of these this week made me think, oh, but this compounds the harm when there's already so many people saying this has been hurtful, or here's how this played out for me. And I think, as someone pointed on here, a commenter said it, and I think you mentioned earlier, it really says, well, if you were harmed, that's because of you, because the teachings can't be touched, or you must have done it wrong, or you must be backsliding, or a slippery slope, or whatever. We fill in the blanks with anything, but the person might have been wrong.
Yes. And the evangelical tendency towards celebrity worship and towards looking for celebrity figures to stand in the public sphere as like people we can champion, that goes, just, that's been the story of American evangelicalism since Billy Graham, even before, where we like the idea that there would be these people so noble that they can stand in the public and be these figures. I just wrapped up writing an article about CCM, Christian Contemporary. A big part of CCM was like, oh my goodness, all these young people are looking to Britney Spears as a role model. We need to have a Christian
really
model
who
can be safe, who can be a Christian role model. And then what you end up doing is you end up creating these musician kind of pop star figures, but then you hold them to a moral standard. And then when they get pregnant out of wedlock, have an affair, come out, you have to take them down. You have to banish them.
And it's immense pressure on people in these roles, that humans cannot be. And I do think it contributes to the divided lives we see. Then there's a moral implosion because there's secret lives, because people have a sort of performative, I need to be exemplary for everyone else, justified by follow me as I follow Christ. And I'm like, I don't think that's what Paul meant. Like, Paul was saying follow Christ. I don't think he was saying it's a good idea for us to be exemplary for one another. So yeah, you're right. And to a certain extent, a receipt comes due for those of us who continue to operate that way, and to say, but we want our people on the pedestals. We want our influence you know, as we buy into that, it does keep the system going in a lot of ways. And I much less into discipline, but Elisabeth Elliot's mother had a switch above every door in every door frame because she wanted it easy, handy to quickly switch legs of toddlers. And Elisabeth Elliot kind of quotes that as like good sound advice. And in passing, she references Ruth Graham and kind of says, I'm in the camp with Ruth Graham, who kept a Bible and a hickory stick on her kitchen counter, you know. And it's so interesting because I think whatever was normalized of the culture in the day, people today will then pick this up. And because Billy Graham's held in such esteem, because Ruth Graham is, because Elisabeth Elliot is, other things remain unquestioned, you know? And so, oh yeah, well, Ruth Graham did that. Therefore, whatever my preconceptions about spanking are, I need to paired with a Ted Tripp book or paired with something else. And it becomes even more difficult to question some of those assumptions, even though I don't think Elisabeth Elliot was necessarily trying to talk about the merits of spanking. She's just mentioning it in passing.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the Ruth Graham example is interesting because, you know, she, I don't know if I have it behind me. She blurbed a book called The Hurting Parent that I've mentioned before that is sort of like this very loving book for parents who feel like their Christian parenting has failed. It's one of the few books that I look at as like a very strong countercurrent to Dobson's teaching. And so to hear that clip about Ruth Graham, I think, oh man, I sort of, that kind of, I mean, doesn't change the way I think about her, but when I saw her blurb on that book, I wondered, I wonder if they had very different parenting ideals than I would expect.
Right. Well, and what I had to wonder, this was another thing, as I was reading this book and the descriptions right after reading her great grandfather's book, thinking about how much just broader cultural norms play in, because a lot of what she describes of the methods, not necessarily the individuals in her family, really reminded me of, like, did you ever read the original Cheaper by the Dozen?
No.
Or the old movie? So part of the premise there in the old original version is that I can't remember which parent, maybe the father is like an efficiency expert, like that's their job. And so I think I'm getting this right. Maybe someone has read this in the who's listening and can say, but it's either Cheaper by the Dozen or one like that. But they run the whole household by the principles of the like 1950s, the modern efficiency, you know, kind of it was enamored with efficiency. And that's what came through in this, where it felt like some of this is a Christian family or some of this is just an efficient family. You know, the ideals of that time are really on display, that we admire order and duty, and there's a time for everything. And this sort of level of, I don't know, sometimes our family watches Mystery Science Theater 3000, which is like, have you seen this?
Yes.
So they do shorts of old like educational promo videos from the 50s, and some of them are like, here's a whole promo video on punctuality or, you know, clothing, and those norms change a lot. And so I don't know if we can make a case that current norms are godlier than they are, or they were godlier. It's an moral issue, but often it's woven together. And so I think people walk away, because I've heard this book, even Cheaper by the Dozen, show up in stacks alongside. Someone messaged me and said, oh no, not that book, because she had seen someone referencing this right by the Pearls book. And it seems like contradictory recommendations, but in other ways you see what you want to see, or you apply what you want to apply. You can find justification for what you want to. I don't know.
Yes, I think that is definitely true.
Oh, good. Someone's saying yes, efficiency expert in Cheaper. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that really is absolutely true of how most parents read parenting books like this. They go looking for answers about certain things, and you kind of filter out other stuff, or I don't know. I think that absolutely explains how someone could have The Hurting Parent next to the Pearls book, next to a Dobson book, next to Ted Tripp. You know, in the same way that people read books by Doug Wilson and John Piper and Tim Keller, and you know, all of these sort of popular pastor teachers, and aren't necessarily looking to criticize anything. They just kind of accept that there is wisdom in all of them. Yeah.
And I do think, people often mitigate in different ways, though as someone who is, I really resonated with her description of Elisabeth Elliot's description of her father in this book, because, and I've talked before, if not here, in other places, of like, as a young person, like scrupulosity and doing it right. And I do think some people are better equipped to read and set aside, or read and pick different things. And others are like, oh my goodness, Tripp's 7 steps, I will implement every single one of them, in this order. And it can really be a difficulty. And I think when it's paired with systems that talk about hierarchy and order, man, it puts people in a bind, because it takes away the freedom they have to challenge spiritual authorities and spiritual fathers and things like this as well, because that is such a sacrosanct ideal. I did find one thing I thought was really funny. Elisabeth Elliot, I don't know if I can find it right now, I'll look for it. She quotes J.C. Ryle's book, which I think it's another old classic child's training. I think it's called like Child Training or something, manual that comes up a lot. But it's so funny because she quotes him at one point in 1880, writing, kind of railing against the modern trend to question spanking. And that made me laugh to think, as long as these conversations have been going on, there have been people pushing back against the norms. And there have been people, Dobson almost echoed it exactly in that Ryle quote. JC kind of is like, does the usual dismissal of like, that can end up being harmful, but what we need is more authority. And in 100 years later, you have Dobson saying the same thing, like, it can be harmful, but what we need is more authority,
Yeah.
So yeah, here's someone saying, that's why Tripp's book is more dangerous to me, because he says this is God's way and insists you take steps. Absolutely. I think by far, I think Tripp's book is the most sinister that I've read for that reason, even though a lot of the other ones have some of those threads. I would agree with that, because he's so authoritative. Like, even maybe Dobson does in his later books, but even in Dare to Discipline, he's very much kind of, he's not trying to make some sort of spiritually heavy-handed case.
Yeah, not usually. Dobson does. I think John Rosemond and Dobson are a good comparison, because
very similar.
The way that Dobson often kind of appeals to these ideas, that he does offer scriptural backing sometimes, but he presents them as very common sense. Like, he sort of presents it like to like, we all true.
Yep.
I was he has a book called Parenting Isn't for Cowards, and I was really struck by this one passage where he's talking about, well, we all know that some kids are easier to love than others. We all have some kids and they're easier to love than the others. Like, some of us have these children that are so sweet, so compliant, love them, and then you have others that aren't. And I'm like, and he's just sort of talking about this like common knowledge, and often relies on that kind of a tone. But Ted Tripp's is much more spiritually manipulative, I think, or much more manipulative in general, in terms of trying to kind of like look under the surface and do some mind reading and some I don't know, just like looking for sin or diagnosing sin, all of these things that he does. I think Dobson does some of that too, but it's not quite as systematic as is. And I found that in Shepherding a Child's Heart to be particularly disturbing.
The systematic, I think, is key, because it really comes with this weight of authority that I think has a devoutness to it. That, as I was talking to my husband, I was like, you see the fire in the I can almost see the fire in his eyes as he's writing it. And I do think Dobson and Rosemond, to a certain extent, and it's interesting that they both are some of the few Christian parenting experts that actually are psychologists who have rejected their psychology credentials to kind of go into common sense parenting. I find that really interesting. But to me, when I read their stuff, it really feels like mansplaining. That flavor, where they're just kind of like, we all know, let me tell you how it is, let me tell you how it was, and there's not a lot of proof or evidence given. And a lot of kind of, here's a story, let's move on, like I'm right kind of thing. So I find that really interesting. I'm looking at some of these other replies to see if we missed something. Anyway, does anyone have any questions or things, if you read the articles where you're like, oh, this I really was hoping? Yeah, a lot of people saying, or here's a comment saying, yes, many of the people touting the formulas for marriage, family refuse to acknowledge the negative fruit and say it's because those specific people weren't faithful. Absolutely. There's no way to kind of actually address it. There's always an out. And really, I guess that's the nature of an idol or icon, someone you've put on a pedestal. Like they can't ever be in error. Someone else says, I think people tie their choices close to authoritarian figures and feel uncomfortable to know they weren't perfect. Yeah,
I think that's
for sure. And I think it can be uncomfortable. I've talked about this when I theorize about why Christian parents don't want to let go of spanking. I think it can just be really personally uncomfortable to reckon with, to look back on our loved ones, either parents or other extended family members or siblings who are parenting in other ways or anything like this, close people we love, and try and reckon with what it means that they're choosing a certain path. It's, I think, easier to say, well, don't question that path than to say, well, what does it take for a parent to get to the calm, cool, detached place to spank or something? It can bring up a lot of very painful things that we don't want to look at, maybe.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's right. I did want to say there is an article, a response to John Fea's article in New York Magazine today. It's called Whitewashing Evangelicalism. I'll try to post it later if I can remember. But it's quite good, and it's a little bit of a counterpoint that touches a lot of the same beats that we touched.
Okay.
But I would recommend it as a good read if you can get the article and then read that one. But if you didn't get the Atlantic article and you want to go read that one, she kind of responds to him, so you can kind of tell what his article is about if you couldn't get
it. I put up, I don't know if it'll work, but there was an MSN link that got around the paywall, but I don't know if that works for everyone. Okay. So it's in my stories to the Fea article. So it's not as nice visually, but you can read the text that way through MSN. But yeah, it was interesting. A lot of interesting conversation around it. A lot of the same dynamics that I think you see in any conversation surrounding anything even touching deconstruction. And I don't necessarily think these things all go hand in hand. I think people can talk about the harms of Dobson's teaching without saying I'm deconstructing, or, you know, that we can talk about abusive marriage dynamics without it necessarily falling under this term that I think has become less and less helpful the more like weaponized it gets used. But I do think a lot of those same talking points were surrounding these articles of, oh, well, the people who are criticizing it are wanting to tear down the faith, or what will outside, I think Fea even mentions this, what will people outside the church think about evangelicalism if all we have is this flat criticism, or these sort of things that I think just aren't really helpful. I think people are on so many different paths, or not even different paths, but different stages of how they're talking about these things and thinking through these things that I don't know. I'm trying not to have knee-jerk reactions when I see knee-jerk reactions, because I think the invitation is always there to listen, and I want to listen to Fea's story as well. I want to listen to people who maybe benefited from Elliot's teaching on family life or marriage as well. Yeah. But I think my heart, especially with the work we're doing, is always like, but those voices have gotten a lot of playtime, and the ways this has harmed have really not, and continue to kind of be overlooked in different ways. And I feel that kind of strongly with Dobson, because I think as he's become more and more political, I don't know how many people are turning to him or Focus on the Family even really for parenting advice. I don't know how robust that is. Like, I follow his Instagram and Focus on the Family, but I don't know how many people, a lot of the interaction there seems to be older generations of parents kind of being like, absolutely, I'm so glad this message is still out there.
Yeah.
But was so formative. And then, of course, as we've talked about, there's the new brands of different things.
Yep. Absolutely.
And then, okay, so I also wanted to ask you, I don't know, we'll probably wrap it up here. Oh, yes, someone says J.C. Ryle, Duty of Parents. That was exactly it. That's the book. We'll do a closer look. I'm going to be doing some reels on each of these books now that they're fresh on my brain. But are you still doing more Tradwife content? Is that kind of where you're headed? And what can we expect? Or
yeah, so that will probably go on for at least another week or so, because I'm working on an article about that for Christianity Today that I'm hoping to come out in the next couple of weeks. So, and then after that, I'm thinking of looking at either Dobson's Parenting Isn't for Cowards, but maybe as part of a bigger survey of a couple books that came out in the 80s and 90s, and tracing how you can kind of see crime wave panic show up in a lot of Christian parenting.
Yeah.
That
not nice that there was crime wave panic, but nice that you're, that's a big piece of what's going on there.
So that's kind of where I'm hoping to head next anyway. How about you now that
these are, now that I'm done with Trip, goodbye Trip. Goodbye Shepherding a Child's Heart. Oh my goodness. I'm going to do these reels while it's all fresh on my mind. And then it was interesting, everyone who responded to the survey, there was kind of a wide range of things. I think I'm going to read, I don't think I'll do as much of a deep dive chapter by chapter. I think I'll end up doing 4 or 5 reels for each resource, just kind of with general themes, I think is maybe more helpful. But I think I'm going to do Habits for the Household? Habits of the Household?
Yeah.
A lot of people have asked me about that one, and it's a newer title. So I think it'll be interesting to read a newer title and kind of reflect on that. And in the meantime, this really aligns with Lent, because if you're in a liturgical church, Lent starts tomorrow. I'm doing all this reading on sin for the theology of sin. I got a couple of really good resources. So I'm hoping after I do all that reading later in the spring to kind of do some close look at how does a hamartiology and understanding of sin trickle into these teachings. So I'm going to do that. And then maybe for kind of, I feel tugged toward 22-year-old me. I kind of want to do a deep dive on The Excellent Wife, even though it's not really related. I mean, she talks a little bit about parenting, just because I feel like that was, I want to revisit that, because that was a book that I was handed and kind of was like, okay, so I think it would be interesting to look back at that. Martha Peace, who wrote that, did co-write a book on parenting. So I may do The Faithful Parent instead, but Excellent Wife still gets me. Whenever I see the clips float around the internet, sometimes I'm always like,
yep,
that one, that's not good. That should not still be handed around to people. Can we stop doing that?
Yep.
But,
cool. Yeah. I'm excited to see all of it.
Yeah. And this is great. I like doing the lives too. Maybe we can do them every couple weeks or something.
Yeah.
It's just great.
Yeah, we talked about doing one on trad wives and maybe on trad husbands as well.
Yeah. I think that would be good.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. And I think I'm glad that you're doing Habits of the Household, because we have not talked as much about Christian fatherhood, partly because most books and parenting content is marketed either implicitly or explicitly towards women. And it's not just true in the Christian space, it's true everywhere. But there is definitely a lot out there geared toward men right now.
And I think I've gotten a couple comments and DMs as you've been doing Tradwife. I think especially in influencer spaces, that has become a whole thing. I think there's been a lot more, I think Above Rubies, etc., has been around for a long time, but Vision Forum did that to fathers as well, for sure, fathers and sons. But I think before that there was for sure less. But in influencers, how would you quantify it? We've got Tradwives. What's the counterpart? Is it like
well, there's like the warrior husband father stuff. Like there's some like gym bro adjacent like fatherhood content out there.
It feels like red pill culture connection. Maybe like red pill Christian, but I feel like we need to name it. Maybe we should do a survey, because most of the people who engage here are women, but we have quite a few fathers and men, and maybe they would know the term.
There's a bit of that, but there's also, like, I would put the author of Habits of the Household in this, like, kind of like
I know nothing about. I have to research. Okay.
Yeah, like he has a lot of influencer content, and he's like, he's like an entrepreneurial business lawyer guy turned family influencer. So like he has been able to pivot into this kind of family teaching.
Oh, interesting.
Um,
That reminds
and
me of Bill Partridge. Do you know who he is? He's like a big trad man
yes.
guy, and he was like a big media, like 7 steps to build a following, and then did a hard pivot. I mean, maybe a conversion experience, but did a hard pivot into this kind of content.
So the author of Habits of the Household, I think, go look. It's interesting because he is far more, I would say, like not trying to go into the like traditional masculinity. It's much more like I'm trying to think of like a good like business self-help guru kind of book that's adjacent to it. It's very much trying to exist in this like neutral male self-help genre, which I think is why Habits is so important here. Like I think this sort of like biohacking, build it like it's like Atomic Habits. Are you familiar with Atomic Habits? It's like that. But you know, so I think there's like
is it pitched at fathers particularly?
I would say, I
guess I'll find out when I read it. I just don't even know.
I would say the book is by him and by someone like him because there is a market for books like this for fathers, and there are fewer people writing them. So I think like, and full disclosure, I mean, this book is in my church's little bookshop in the front. Like it's a very popular book, you know.
It seems to be. Yeah. That's why I've heard it so many, and I wasn't familiar with it.
And I might read it alongside of you again because I have read it and now I just don't remember a lot of it. But it is like very much kind of in that like Atomic Habits, things implement these systems, these ideas, and a lot of them I think probably quite benign. But when you consider the person, the platform, the way that it fits into the market of this kind of literature, I find it I don't know. I'm not disguising my opinions about this. I'm not being very neutral here. I'm sorry. I promise you, I will give this book a fair shake. But I've become a little bit critical of stuff that I feel like was a little bit like grown in a lab for a particular market.
Right.
If someone's very reformed theology heavy, I think that's probably also true.
Well, and this kind of takes me back to the whole cheaper by the dozen efficiency expert. Like it does creep in different ways, and when it's conflated with godliness, that can become problematic. It's like all these things, right? Like personal preference, personality, so much freedom, and freedom. Maybe efficiency, cheaper by the dozen, works very well for some families, but to sort of say, therefore, if you don't do this, you are ungodly and not doing it right, and need to aspire to this is just a heavy yoke for people. It's the trad wife yoke in different garb.
I think that's right. So I'm so curious about all of this. I'm like building a long.
But we'll see, because this was a total pivot. I was going to start reading that book, but then this was the Fea and Grant article came up, and I was like, all right, we'll be touching on Dobson and Elisabeth Elliot, and so that was good. We have shelves and shelves of books to read, so it can come in any order. This was great.
A lot to cover. So much to cover. There's gonna be so much reading of this over the next year, so I'm excited.
I know. Thank you to all of those of you who are following along with us for it, because it's fun to share as we go different things.
If you have an idea, if anyone listening still has an idea for like a topic that you'd like to see us discuss in real time, we're looking for ideas. We don't have a system. This is not very orchestrated.
Right. So far it's just like, hey, here's something that popped up. Do you want to talk about it live?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we've been talking for far more than an hour at this point. So I will I'll cut us off here. But thanks again.
Yeah. Thank you.
To talk with you.
Good to see you. Bye, friends.
Bye, everybody.